This episode is brought to you by Cox Contour TV. Find the entertainment you love with Contour TV and Contour Stream Player. Learn more at cox.com/contour.
The Portland metro area is in the midst of an ongoing gun violence crisis, and homicides are already on pace to eclipse last year's record in the city. But there's another crisis that claimed more lives in Portland and Multnomah County last year that doesn't get as much attention. Fentanyl overdoses. I'm Andrew Thien, and this is Beat Check with the Oregonian. Up next, Maxine Bernstein, who's covered cops and courts for the Oregonian and Oregon Live for more than 2 decades. We talked about her recent deep dive into fentanyl, what fentanyl is, where it comes from, the 2 Northeast Portland teens who died earlier this year, and what their parents have to say, and how social media, as with any other part of our society, is playing a major role. Here's our conversation. Maxine Bernstein, thanks for coming back on the show.
Thanks for having me.
So, Max, we've had such a challenging few years in the Portland area, in particular with gun violence, and we've talked about that quite a bit. But you recently took a deeper look into a drug many people are likely becoming more and more familiar with. Why'd you want to look into fentanyl?
Because covering federal court, I'm seeing case after case involving alleged distribution of fentanyl, and it's taken over past cases of meth and heroin distribution, and also the back-to-back accidental overdose deaths of 2 Portland high school students in March, at one 16 and the other was 17 years old from the same high school, really brought this issue to the forefront. So that was part of the reason.
Yeah, and we'll talk about Olivia Coleman and Griffin Hoffman a little bit later because you wrote a really heart-wrenching stories about those 2. But I guess can we get to the very elemental, what is fentanyl? I think a lot of people might not really have any idea what it is.
Sure. It's a synthetic opioid, and it was initially approved years ago for medical use as a surgical anesthetic, mostly for people with chronic pain and typically cancer patients. And opioids includes morphine or oxycodone or heroin. But unlike those opioids, fentanyl doesn't come from an opium poppy. So it's a synthetic product, meaning it's formed through chemical process. It's not derived from plants. That means it can be produced quickly, and there's a unlimited supply of it, and it is more powerful than morphine or heroin. It's been said that it's 50 to 100 times stronger than morphine, and just a tiny amount can be lethal.
And again, so this was originally intended to be useful in a pain medication setting, and like you said, for people who might be in a lot of pain, like cancer patients.
Correct.
So when did it make the leap from that world to the streets, so to speak? And where are people making fentanyl, and how's it coming to Oregon?
Sure. Fentanyl is said to have been introduced into the illicit drug supply in the early 2010s, and it's easily distributed through social media. Forums such as Snapchat or Telegram have made these pills that are made with fentanyl. Fentanyl is pressed into what looks like prescription pills, but they're sold as OxyContin or Xanax or Percocet, but often these pills are counterfeit, the ones that are sold on the street and not prescribed, and are more frequently being made with fentanyl because it's so cheap to produce. So that's a major factor leading to these fentanyl deaths, is the fraudulent way that they're marketed and sold. People don't know what they're getting. They don't know what they're taking. And it's showing up not only in these counterfeit pills, but it's also being mixed with heroin and cocaine. DEA and narcotics enforcement investigators says the bulk of fentanyls coming in from the precursor chemicals are coming from China into Mexico. And that's where the illicit fentanyl is being pressed into these fake pills and then transported up the West Coast and into the U.S. by bus, by car, by truck, even by mail, all the way up through the U.S. into Canada.
Yeah, so it's a global operation in terms of it has its roots, like you said, in China and Mexico, and then that's how it comes into the country.
Right.
So covering public safety, law enforcement, as you have for so long. I mean, there's so many photos of that law enforcement agencies put out and when they're making a drug bust and, might have been marijuana in the 90s, whether there's a lot of guns that are seized. We're used to these kind of staged photos, but some of the seizure figures and the photos of these fentanyl pills, the counterfeit pills you mentioned that are being shared across the digital transom on our flash alert system are pretty staggering. We're talking hundreds of thousands of pills, right?
Sure. So earlier this year, narcotics agents seized about 150,000 counterfeit oxycodone pills made with fentanyl, plus about 20 pounds of fentanyl powder, in what they said or what they believe was the biggest seizure of the drug in Oregon's history. And then there's a multi-agency law enforcement task force called the Oregon-Idaho High Intensity Drug Trafficking Area Program, and they reported that last year their officers seized 1.5 million counterfeit pills made with fentanyl, which was a 51% increase from 2020. And 137% increase from the year before, 2019.
It's truly staggering figures, and that actually is correlating in the number of overdose deaths as well, right? In terms of, you mentioned that this is a deadlier or potentially more lethal drug, and that has shown up in the overdose figures both in Oregon and in Multnomah County.
Yes. So in Multnomah County, 73 people died of fentanyl overdoses, including 2 under the age of 18 in 2020, according to the county's health officer. And that number jumped to 139 people just in the first 9 months of last year, of which 4 were under the age of 18. And in Oregon, as elsewhere, teen overdose deaths have spiked in the last 2 years, largely the result of fentanyl, even though teen drug use in general has been falling, according to national studies.
I want to just kind of linger on those figures for a minute, Max. I mean, 139 people in Multnomah County in the first 9 months of last year. I don't have the county homicide figures off the top of my head. That seems to be dramatically higher than the number of people who died in gun violence in Multnomah County last year.
Yeah, it's pretty staggering. And I know that the families that are impacted by this are really trying to educate the community, educate the public, and trying to get this awareness about the danger of fentanyl more prominent in our school system and among our educators.
Well, that's a good transition to talk about Olivia Coleman and Griffin Hoffman. Let's start with Olivia. Can you just paint a little portrait of her life and how ultimately fentanyl came into her life?
Sure. So Olivia Coleman was a junior at McDaniel High School in Portland. She spoke with her mother and father. She had just turned 17 this January, and she was found dead in her bedroom on March 6th. She was a student who dreamed of becoming a child psychologist someday, was really fond of children and often babysat her cousins. She apparently thought she was taking oxycodone, and however, the autopsy showed that she died of fentanyl poisoning, and they found her about 10:30 in the morning in her room. And this was a girl who had struggled with anxiety and substance abuse that the parents knew about, and they had been trying to get her into treatment. And she was in substance abuse counseling and had been in the last 4 months of her life. But, and those were mostly Zoom-based substance abuse group sessions and one-on-one counseling several days a week, her mother said. And it was just, it's crushing to this family. The mom said Olivia had a lot she was looking forward to. It was before spring break. She was hoping to see one of her best friends who had moved away, was expecting to visit. So this is not something that was intended. Her mom said they knew in the past that she had used Snapchat to try to order pills like oxycodone, and someone had driven up to their house and had sold her pills in the past. And they even considered, someone had suggested to her mother, that they put out cameras outside the house, and they weren't about to do that. But now they're struggling and hoping to learn who may have sold her the pills that were deadly.
And like you said, she's a young woman who was honest with her parents about her struggles and about how she obtained these illicit drugs in the past, and still ultimately it was they couldn't prevent it.
They sensed their daughter was suffering setbacks, and they wondered, what they could have said or done to make a difference. They considered inpatient residential treatment for her, but said there was at least a 2-month wait list before she'd be accepted.
And what about Griffin Hoffman? Can you talk about his life and your story on him?
Sure. Griffin turned 16 in February. He was a sophomore at McDaniel High School and a star tennis player on the varsity team. He just went out one night with his friends to the movies, and the next morning, it was March 7th, the day after Olivia Coleman's death, he was found at his desk with his earbuds still in and his laptop open, and he couldn't be revived. And his mom said her son, may have experimented with marijuana, but they found also, the investigators called to the home, found the remnants of a blue fake pill, and it turned out to be fentanyl that he died of. As a result of that, back-to-back deaths of these two students from the same school led detectives to immediately go to the school and pull out the friends of Griffin who went with him to the movies the night before, and, just also to alert students of this danger, hoping that, others hadn't taken these pills, and also trying to figure out where they came from. He hoped to one day, win a scholarship to play tennis in college. He played from a young age at the Portland Tennis Center. There was a memorial, but either the next day or a couple of nights later at the tennis courts right beside the school where he competed.
When you talk to these families who just obviously just pulverized by grief, but what do they hope that other parents of teenagers, any lessons to be gleaned from this? Because it just seems, you're a parent of teenagers. This just seems so terrifying, added to everything else that you're dealing with as a parent, to have to worry about this.
Yeah, I think, they want to make sure kids know that you shouldn't be taking any pill that is not prescribed by your doctor. I think a lot of teens, I have two teenage boys, it's a period of experimenting as much as I might want to and try to drum into them the danger of this. I I was reporting all through this, and I'm reporting from home. And so every time I would get off, finish an interview with a distraught parent, I'd unfortunately be in my own teenage boys' faces, explaining to them what I've learned and what happened to these other kids. And, I hope it makes a difference. I hope it makes a difference, but, there's only so much. But, I think a lot of teens think they can trust their friends at this point. And that was one of these parents' lessons, that no, you can't even trust your friends. I mean, whatever, you think you're getting a pill from a friend, that it is what they say it is. No, because no one knows what's in these pills. Only, should only be taking prescription pills that you get from a pharmacy that's prescribed by a doctor.
I know that there's, that's probably how a lot of kids experiment with drugs in the first place, is maybe you have a friend who has an injury who has some of these pills, and maybe that's your entree into that world. But obviously that has pitfalls that expand to the social media realm and everything beyond that.
Right. And one of the lead federal drug prosecutor in Oregon, Steve Migrant, said, he suspects that teens are gravitating to these pills because they may carry less of a stigma. There's not the intravenous drug use with other drugs, and it's marketed on social media that teens are have their faces in. But that's why it is so important to educate these youth.
Let's take a quick break, and then we'll come back and talk just a bit more with Maxine Bernstein.
This episode is brought to you by Cox Contour TV. Sometimes it's hard to decide what to watch, but Cox Contour TV helps make that decision easier. Enjoy live TV, on-demand programs, DVR recordings, and music all in one place. And only with the sound of your voice with the Contour voice remote. Plus, catch the golf and basketball action you've been waiting for on the Contour Sports app. Learn more at cox.com/Contour.
So, Max, you talked about prosecuting these cases a little bit, and given kind of everything that we've talked about with how the drugs are maybe originating overseas and on social media, that seems like quite a challenge. What are some of the challenges in terms of prosecuting these cases that you've heard from people in law enforcement and in the legal world?
A lot of it is trying to prove, exactly who provided the deadly pill to the deceased, and their intent, and were they aware of the ingredients of what they sold to whoever they sold it to. There's federal law enforcement agencies are working with local police to try to intercept the supply of these pills, and they're trying to intercept it and cut off the distribution of fentanyl. But it's so large a problem that, they recognize that whatever they're doing can make a dent, but it's not gonna eradicate the drug.
You reported on, trying to track down where people might have received drugs in some of these fatal instances. That brings up the story of Wade May, right? Because this is kind of the circumstances surrounding his fatal overdose of fentanyl. Where did he get the pills, and what do we know about the person who is implicated in that?
So Wade May was a 37-year-old man who lived in North Plains, and one night in late September 2020, he was found in his home suffering from what his friends suspected was an overdose. And he was rushed to the hospital, and he died the next morning from what turned out to be a fentanyl overdose. his family flew in from out of state, and really his mom was worked herself to try to locate the friends who were with him, try to understand and find out who supplied the pills that he had taken, or one pill that he had taken, and tried to share that with law enforcement. And what they learned was that this man who was prosecuted, his name was Brandon Kingsley Jones, that he was the second removed source of supply to Wade May, that he had given it to someone else who had sold it to May. Yet this man, Bradley Jones, had previously been tied by law enforcement at least 4 months earlier to another overdose death of a Washington County man. He was on their radar. They had questioned and interviewed him months earlier, told him that they suspected his sale of fentanyl to another man then had led to his death, and they made him aware they were continuing to investigate. And apparently he continued to sell, and his drugs suspected of leading to the death of Wade May in late September. So Jones was prosecuted in the initial overdose death and for distribution of these pills, and law enforcement set up surveillance of him, and they found him, just meeting a guy in the parking lot of a 7-Eleven in Northeast Portland, where, he parked his car and gets out and goes up to the window of this other car and sells the pills. And that led that night to a different Washington County man's death, 31-year-old, wasn't identified in court by name, but Jones got 6.5 years in federal prison in that case.
So when you look at just kind of the scale of this issue, and it's got tentacles both in the digital world and, outside the state that are really hard factors for us to control. What other takeaways do you have for people reading your work? I mean, what would you want people to be thinking about?
I guess the biggest takeaway is education, and educating everyone, from youth to young adults, not to take anything that's not prescribed, because you don't know what's in it. The person on the street selling it doesn't know what's in it. Yes, there are these test strips for fentanyl that can detect if there might be fentanyl in one pill, but just because it shows there's not fentanyl in one pill doesn't show that there isn't fentanyl in the rest of that batch or a different part of the pill. So those aren't foolproof. It's better. And now the schools, at least Portland public schools, and I know other districts are distributing Narcan, or it's a medication, an overdose, reverser medication that's important to try to prevent these deaths. And police also, Portland police, are distributing it to all patrol officers. But, the main takeaway is you don't know what you're taking. You shouldn't be taking any pills that are not prescribed by your doctor.
What's the response been like to your stories about Olivia Coleman and Griffin Hoffman, and then your recent piece on kind of the scale of this issue? Because people in the newsroom are reporting on gun violence a lot. I'm curious what the feedback. Are you hearing from people who've lost loved ones or who are dealing with kind of the education challenge that you're talking about?
Yeah, I'm hearing from other parents or grandparents who've lost people in Oregon. There's a National Fentanyl Awareness Day coming up on May 10th. Some nonprofit agencies and family organizations and others working to get the word out of the danger of this drug. So yeah, I've heard, appreciation for helping to educate the public about the problems. I rode a week or so ago with officers from the Central Precinct Bike Patrol who patrol largely the city's Old Town neighborhood. And, those officers said, even just a year ago, they'd see black tar heroin or methamphetamine, but now fairly everyone that they arrest, they find, stuck in their pockets or their bags, this crumpled up tinfoil, which is holding the residue of blue fake counterfeit pills of fentanyl that they smoke and inhale. And that's the number one problem. But even if they find a small amount of the drug, they can issue a citation. So they issue a citation, and on the back of the citation is a card with, a number that they can reach to get a free health screening. But they're issuing it over and over to a lot of the same people. So they're frustrated.
And this is a result of the voter-approved Measure 110?
I believe it is partly a result of that because this is small user amounts that don't amount to a criminal charge.
Thank you for all of your reporting to highlight this really terrifying issue and for taking time to talk about it.
Appreciate it.
Thanks for listening to Beat Check with the Oregonian. I shared links to some of Max's recent stories about fentanyl, including her profiles of the 2 McDaniel High School students who overdosed in the episode notes. May 10th is the first ever National Fentanyl Awareness Day. To find out more information about how to educate yourself and your family, or to learn more about this crisis, go to www.fentylawarenessday.org. If you like this show, give us a 5-star rating and review in Apple Podcasts. It really helps others find the show. The best way to support our journalism is through a subscription to Oregon Live. You can do that at OregonLive.com/pod support. Until next time.